Okay, so now we're going to welcome Helen Higgins. She's from the School of Veterinary Science in Liverpool, and her presentation is on what do UK vets think about the efficacy of teat sealants versus antibiotics for preventing infections. So thank you very much, Helen, and we look forward to your presentation.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed. So, for this piece of research, the population of cows that I was interested in were cows that have all four quarters that are genuinely uninfected at drying off. And they're all going to receive an intramammary, long-acting antibiotic, cephalonium. And in this population, there's a 30% chance, or 0.3 probability, that a quarter will be infected at calving. So that's the situation we've got, and we can take that as a given, if you like. And my question was, assuming everything else stays the same, and nothing changes except for the fact that we swap the cephalonium for a teat sealant, what then will happen to the probability that a quarter will become infected? So this is a direct question about which of these two products is better at preventing the acquisition of new intramammary infections across the dry period, okay? And why I was interested in that question is because in the UK, unlike the Netherlands, we are still allowed to use blanket dry cow therapy, and indeed a lot of our farmers are still doing that, and they've been doing that actually for really quite a long time. But obviously, if we could get them to swap over to doing selected dry cow therapy, then we could demonstrably reduce our antibiotic use, which would obviously be fantastic. So when it comes to my question about which of these two products is the better one, that's a key question underpinning selected dry cow therapy, potentially, because if vets currently think that teat sealants are hopeless and don't work at preventing cows becoming infected and antibiotics are brilliant, but then perhaps they'll be more concerned about advising farmers and trying to win over their hearts and minds and getting them to swap over to being more selective. But just to note, of course, their opinion about this is just one tiny part of the bigger picture of how do we persuade, cajole, etc., farmers who've been doing blanket dry cow therapy for their lifetime to break a habit of the lifetime and change over to doing something else. And there are clearly many potential practical barriers here, and also potentially what I'd call some psychological issues, such as worries over it making the clinical situation worse, iatrogenic infections and so forth. So the aims of this experiment were to quantify vets' beliefs for this particular question, and then to show them some new data and see how they interpreted and updated their beliefs in light of it, and to make some sort of attempt to assess how logical vets are in interpreting new evidence. And the reason I think assessing how logical people are is important because this is fundamental to evidence-based veterinary medicine. Evidence-based practice relies very heavily on new data being produced and the clinical community, you at large, reading and interpreting it and adjusting what you're thinking in at least a fairly rational, appropriate way. Okay, and I think evidence-based medicine going forward in the fight against AMR is going to be increasingly important. So when it comes to how logical people are, what do we know from the literature already? Well, we know here that there's controversy at the moment. So going back to the 1960s with the experimental psychologists, they basically came to the conclusion that we are rubbish, we're hopeless, we're prone to all sorts of nasty biases and errors in our judgment, all sorts of nasty negative emotional reactions when people show us data that flies in the face of what we believed previously. And so all of this is not conducive to being entirely rational. On the other hand, more recent research has been done by, again, a lot by psychologists in Germany and so forth, saying actually people can be astonishingly logical, but quite a lot depends on how you frame the task. And more work from neuroscience suggesting fundamentally the way our brains are wired is actually very logical. But none of this has been done in a veterinary context. So if we're going to assess how logical people are, I need something to compare them to, so I need a gold standard. And so I use Bayes' theorem, And just for those to keep those up to speed who don't know what that is, we can think of BASIM as a black box, if you like, and into that black box we can put what I personally believe now about this issue of cephalonium versus teat sealants. We can put into it the new evidence that I've just read and interpreted, and all BASIM will do is it will rationally combine those two things together and tell us what should I now logically believe. So given what I thought beforehand, here's the new evidence, this is what I should now believe. But obviously, because BASIM is actually a mathematical equation, we can't put words about what I believe into the box. We have to capture the person's opinion in a format that BASIM can cope with. And in particular, we have to capture their opinion as a probability distribution. And I went through this in the talk on Monday in quite a bit of detail about how you can actually, one way you can actually do that and capture their opinion that way. So I'm not going to go over that again, but if anyone is interested, you can always, I think that those talks will record, you can go back and look at it. So what we're going to end up with, we've got the thing we're interested in, what's the probability that a quarter given a teat sealant is infected at calving. That can obviously go from 0 chance to 100% or probability of 1. And we've got cephalonium. What will happen if we give cephalonium? There'll be a 0.3 or 30% chance a quarter will be infected. So as you look at the screen, if you're to the right of that, then you're saying teat sealant makes things worse compared to cephalonium. If you're to the left, you're saying a teat sealant is the better product, okay? And when we capture people's opinions as a probability distribution, we're going to end up with two things. We're going to end up with their best guess for what they think the answer is, which we can denote by a dot. And in this case, this person believes that teat sealants, their best guess is they're not as good as cephalonium, okay? But we're also going to end up with how confident they are. And we can represent that by a line. So the line is what they consider to be a plausible range for the answer. So in this particular example, the person is really confident, okay? Because they're saying, oh yeah, okay, my best guess is 0.4. It's possible the answer could be slightly more or slightly less than that, but pretty much it's there or thereabouts, okay? So they're quite confident. This person, however, is far more unsure, yeah, because they're saying, yeah, my best guess is 0.4, but it's plausible that that in particular that teat sealants could actually be better than cephalonium. I'm going to give that's a possibility for me, okay? So they're carrying much more uncertainty. So I went out and I interviewed 20 vets. Individual face-to-face interviews in their practices. And so this next slide is the results in terms of what they actually thought the answer to the question was. So this is before I show them any evidence at all. What did they believe? So I've got my 20 vets stacked up here. Each one's got a dot that says this was my best guess, and each one's got a line that says this is how confident I was. And as you can see, most people have got their best guess favouring teat sealants being better, okay, but not quite everybody. So a couple of people, best guess it's going to make things a bit worse. And differences in terms of how confident people were. So some people, this chap or chapette at the bottom, really quite confident, yep, teat sealants a lot better than cephalonium, I'm confident about that. But other people carrying rather more uncertainty, okay? In total, I had 8 vets who were, if you like, entirely convinced that teat sealants were the better product, in that their plausible range was not giving any possibility that teat sealants could be worse. But I had 12 people who whilst a lot of them, their best guess was teat sealants would be better, they were acknowledging that it was possible teat sealants might not be as good, okay? So not everyone entirely convinced that teat sealants are better, 100% convinced if you like, and potentially that has some implications in terms of trying to be one of the parts in trying to convince, get farmers to swap over and break a habit of lifetime and go to selective dry cow therapy. So and a range of opinions there. So having done that, I then showed them some new evidence. And I didn't have any actual evidence of my own, so I'm making the data up. And so this is a clinical trial involving, with 1,000 quarters have been involved in the trial. And the results of the trial, they get told, the vets, depends entirely on what they believe to begin with. So But here, unlike the experiment I showed you on Monday, I'm not being as nasty as I was on Monday. I'm being quite nice. So I'm not radically challenging what they believe to start with, okay? I'm showing them data that's actually not that different to what their original opinion was. And then I recapture their opinions after that, and I say I'm going to try and assess how logically did they update what they thought, and I'm going to look at these two things separately. So I'm going to look at their best guess, and then I'm also going to look at how confident they were. So if we look at best guess first, this is just a dead simple scatter plot. So I've got my 20 vets, each vet is a cross on here, and on the x-axis I've got what their best guess was actually after seeing the data, and on the y-axis I've got what they should have believed if they'd been completely logical. So obviously the diagonal line is where these two things are exactly the same, okay? So they got it right, that's the right answer. And as you can see, my 20 vets, they really did quite well on this particular task, yeah? Everyone was on the line roughly either exactly or very close, okay? So that was cool. Then in terms of what about their confidence, though? So this is a very similar scatter plot. I'm plotting how confident they were after seeing the data. Versus what their confidence should have been according to Bayes' theorem. So, and the numbers here are actually the standard deviation of their posterior distribution. So again, if they got it right, they'd be dead on the line, dead on the diagonal line. That's being entirely logical. So 4 out of my 20 vets were perfectly logical in terms of their confidence. And interestingly, those 4 vets also were perfectly logical in terms of their best guess. So 4 out of 20 people were completely in keeping with Bayesian logic when they interpreted that data. However, quite a lot of people didn't do quite so well on this task, and because they're below the line, the diagonal line, what that means is they either became more unsure than they were to start with, or they weren't confident enough. So either way, that's not entirely logical. So they failed to draw enough strength from that new evidence. Nobody, however, was above the line, so nobody became overconfident having seen that new data, okay? So in summary then, I think it's fair to say not everybody, to be fair, it's only 20 vets, it is, I acknowledge, a really small sample, but in my particular sample, not everybody was 100% convinced of the efficacy of teat sealants, which potentially has implications in terms of vets being, really enthusiastic and passionate about trying to facilitate farmers changing over to doing selective dry cow therapy. It is, I personally think, it's difficult to always be entirely logical, particularly when I've stood up in front of a whole room full of scary people. But nevertheless, some people in my study were entirely rational in their thinking. But generally speaking, I've done a few of these experiments now, people tend not to draw enough confidence from the data. So they're much better at their best guess and getting that in the right place, but being sufficiently confident that that's the right answer, people tend to struggle with more. And people don't tend to actually become overconfident. So if you're a clinical researcher producing some new evidence and wanting to understand how that impacts the clinical community, that potentially is worth keeping in mind. And I think training people and using this kind of Bayesian statistical framework, which is what it is, to try and help people to consciously think a bit more about how they are interpreting new data could be useful in terms of having a more efficient transfer of research into practice. But as I say, there's only one part of the story, and the other half of the interviews I did with these vets was asking them for qualitative information. So I asked them open questions about what they thought were the barriers and motivators to getting selective dry cow therapy implemented in practice. And I haven't got time to present the results here for that today, but I will be presenting it at the British Cattle Veterinary Association conference in the autumn if anybody is interested. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions. I just forgot my acknowledgements. Sorry, I'm out of time. I was going to say thank you to all the vets who took part. Huge thank you. To John and Ian from West Point Veterinary Group. To Alex Cook from Surrey. And this was funded by a grant from the University of Surrey. Sorry.
No, thank you very much. Marvellous presentation there from Helen Higgins. Very well done. Thank you very much, Helen.